All right, so we took a week break last week. We're back to tough questions. For anyone just joining us, the idea of this study was hard questions people might ask if they're curious about the faith or maybe if they're adversarial about the faith, and kind of testing you. And so we've gone through a whole bunch of these. Most of them are online if you missed them. And I always have notes if you want my notes. This last one is about the compatibility of science and faith, and where science sometimes, and I would say less than great science, becomes a problem with faith. And specifically, you always hear the story where kids go off to college and they get presented with a different understanding of science from what they were taught in Sunday school, and it causes a question about faith. And I think part of that's on the church, for we haven't done a good enough job presenting an alternative scientific way of thinking about this. And I don't know how many of you guys know my background. My initial career choice was biology teacher. So I've got the biology degree I never use, except for stuff like this. So this will be fun. But we're going to kind of take a look at this, and basically I'm going to give you a few things. Obviously we're not doing this in depth. This would take a long time to do in depth, and I'm not a master of all of these subjects by any means, and I'm a little rusty, to be honest. But there are significant holes in modern evolutionary theory, and I just want to present you with some of those holes that can help you make up your own mind and maybe help others make up their own mind about what you might have faith in. The prevailing theories of man or what God reveals to us. Okay? So I'll just ask you guys this one. Does science conflict with the Bible? Yes? Okay, I got some heads yet. Defend yourself, Barry. Why no?
Because I believe that science is discovering what God already knows.
Okay.
Proves it.
Okay.
The details.
Yeah.
The science that does contradict is still in theory form even though it's taught as fact.
Okay, the science that does contradict is still a theory. And yeah, I would actually say that good science does not conflict with the Bible. Some prevailing scientific theory does conflict with the Bible. So if you answered yes or no, you have a way to argue that. But yeah, there's a lot of what is commonly believed in science right now that does conflict with the Bible. I would say what is provable, that's a different story, and that's kind of what we're going to talk about. Jeff, you had a hand up here?
I guess just to get the ball rolling, science indicates that there was, life on Earth well before the Bible suggested it started.
Yeah. You ask a scientist, they're probably going to give you an age of the Earth of 4.5 billion years old. You read Genesis and the rest of the Bible, you can't come away with that date. The biblical narrative kind of gives you, I've heard ranges between 6,000 and 14,000 years old. I haven't studied that part close enough to give you where I think that is, but we're talking thousands of years, not millions, or even hundreds of thousands. And so that's a big difference, yeah. And who's got it right is a question we do need to ask ourselves.
Well, the way I've looked at that, too, another way is to say, the Bible is very unclear. I will say that. The Bible isn't very specific in terms of this period where there is void.
Which void?
Well,
First one.
yeah.
Sure.
And so I've always said, well, if the fact that the Earth is older, it simply means that time frame that God was working in was not, they used days because that's something people could understand. They couldn't understand billions.
Yeah, and I'll use a little humility here. Could have God communicated something to us in a way that's understandable to us? Yeah. My biggest argument with that mind, I am a 7-day creationist, and in the literal sense, a day means 24 hours. That's where I come down on this. Now, there are Christians who don't, and we'll talk about that, but my biggest mindset with this is the same guy wrote Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. And throughout it, the same word for day is used.
Well, PK, several years ago, had a sermon. He talked about, he's the same way as you.
Yeah.
7 days.
Yeah.
He said the sun would rise
Yep.
and set.
Yep.
And the 7 days. So,
Mhm.
I mean, I used to believe kind of
Sure.
differently, and then PK had that sermon.
Yep.
That
Yep.
changed my mindset.
Now, we'll talk in a bit, can some buying into some evolutionary thought and faith coexist? We'll talk about that in just a second. But yeah, that's a question. We'll get to this age of the earth thing. We'll talk about this today or next time, depending on how far we get. Any other thoughts to start here? Okay. So let's read Genesis 1. So we've got I didn't have any scripture in this Bible study at first, so we got to put some in. And someone,
Can I just make one other comment too,
Yeah.
just before we go? So when we talk about science too, science is something that by its very nature is always changing.
yep,
And so
Yep.
science, 1,000 years ago,
uh-huh,
held a very different view
Yeah.
than science today. And science, 500 years from now, probably will have quite a different viewpoint of what they think is fact
Yeah.
today. And so that, to me, that's a big difference, where science is an ever-evolving exploration
Yeah.
of the world, where faith is, it doesn't change. It
Yeah.
doesn't change.
And I hope you guys heard Bill there. Throughout the last 2,000 years or so, there have been lots of things scientists knew to be true that we now know are very false. Versus what we have revealed to us by an all-powerful God. And that is something to remember, that we've got all these things, science, we got a lot of smart scientists, and I don't want to denigrate science. I think science is great, and it's allowed us to do a lot of things, and I think it's actually a gift from God. Kind of how Barry put it, a exploration of God's beautiful creation. But we're exploring the complexity of it and understanding it versus inventing it. And there's lots of stuff that we're currently wrong about, and history shows there have been lots of instances where the smartest people in the world had some theories that are just plain wrong. And so, without a doubt, certain theories of science right now are wrong. And I've got some thoughts on which ones those are. And but there are others that I probably think are completely right scientifically that we just don't have a full understanding of. And yeah, that's a really good point, Bill. All right, someone or a couple people read for us Genesis chapter 1.
In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was And God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. And God set them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the fourth day.
Someone keep going here.
And God said, let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the heavens. So God created the great sea creatures and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarm, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters and the seas, and let the birds multiply on the earth. And there was evening, and there was morning, the fifth day. And God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds, livestock, and creeping things, and beasts of the earth according to their kinds. And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and the livestock according to their kinds, and everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. And God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And God said, behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the heavens, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food. And it was so. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day.
I'm going to just keep going a little bit. Thus the heavens and earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from the work he had done in creation. Real quick, anything we noticed in there that we forgot about, or anything that struck us differently this time?
Us.
Let us make them in our image. How do we explain that given the rest of Scripture? The triune God. It's present there in the very first verse. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void. The darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. In this, you've got Father, Son, and Holy Spirit right away. God makes that a little more clear to us what that means throughout the rest of his word. But this pronoun of us instead of I made it. And so, yep. And John clarifies some of this for us. He says, through him, through Jesus, was not anything made that was made. So Jesus is one of the agents of creation, there with God at the beginning. You get a little further and you go to the fall, and God walking in the garden as Adam and Eve hide themselves. Who do we understand is walking in that garden? Jesus. Anytime God is seen or experienced in a visible presence with sinful humans, it's Jesus.
They weren't sinful yet.
After the fall.
Oh,
After the fall there. Yep, they're hiding because they knew what they did wrong. Yeah. I don't know before that. Could Adam and Eve look upon the face of the Father before that? That's a question you'll ask when you get there, okay?
got an assignment, Ted.
Yep. Anything else we notice in here? Barry?
There's one thing, I didn't catch this before, but on the first day, he created light and darkness. He created light to separate.
Yes.
But the stars and the sun weren't created until the
Yep.
third day, the
Yep.
fourth day. And I thought, okay, well then, how did they have light before they created the sun, which we know is what produces the light?
Yeah, so what's the source of light?
Well, God can create light and darkness. He created
God
light,
is.
and then he created the sun to be that source
Yep.
later, is the way I would interpret it.
Yeah. Yeah, the way you should think about it is God is the source of light. And later he created secondary sources to govern. You could argue, what does light mean in the first verse? Yeah, I won't go that far, but this is an illustration God gives us constantly, Jesus especially, light versus darkness. And it's present from the very beginning. Okay. Anything else we noticed in there? Kim?
He named this thing we're on Earth.
Mm-hmm.
So just in terms of dry land, where did we get, the Aegean Sea and the names for these things? He named them.
Mm-hmm.
He gave them seas, he called it Earth,
Yep.
and I guess science, my question is down the line, we'll see in terms of all of the other planets, those named later.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, so he names Earth. He names Adam and Eve. And then, in the second chapter, he gives naming rights of everything else to Adam and Eve. Rule over it. This is one of the things we look at as ruling, is the ability to give a name to something. You talk about like parents and children. You name them. You are the steward of them until they reach adulthood. And, this is kind of what God gave. God had the authority over Adam and Eve. He named them. Actually, Adam named Eve, sorry. He named Adam, and then Adam named Eve, and then Adam and Eve named the animals. And it's this sign of authority and responsibility. Yeah, it is interesting in there.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Again, I'm just asking the hard question.
Sure.
Somebody who is not a believer might ask.
Yep.
So in the very first verse, it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens.
Mm-hmm.
What are the heavens?
Yeah.
Is that heaven as in the spiritual heaven, or is it, because he talks about creating the expanse and all that later, so what are these heavens? I mean, I've read that a gazillion times and never thought about it.
Yeah.
What are-
Probably better understood, not so much as stars and planets, but probably better understood as the spiritual realm in which God operates. Now, it could be the space in which the stars and heavens take up.
I never thought
Yeah.
about that before.
I'm speculating a little bit here because that's the best answer we get is what's written right.
To ask right after.
Yeah, we can ask that one right after. Sherry, then Norm.
You can see his plan of eternity just because he provided propagating food that would propagate continually over and over and over again
Yeah.
to feed everyone.
Yeah. This was a sustainable creation. Now, some people look at God as like kind of the clockmaker God, where he starts it and then is hands off. And that's proper in a sense. God did give us a sustainable earth, but he never leaves it and just says, go be on your own. So you can take that to some degree that it is a sustainable earth, and he made it with the ability to continue to keep going and sustain life. And this is part of our evolution discussion, is we'll talk about some principles of evolution that do work, and I think God intended, without going so far as to say, I'm the product of evolution. But yeah, absolutely. Did that answer everything there? Norm, go ahead.
Couldn't, when you're getting to the heavens and the earth, couldn't it just been as simple as the atmosphere around the earth?
Sure, it could be. It could be, yeah.
Area for, everything like to exist.
Yeah. Well, you look at, and this is fascinating, you look at our astronomy now, and all we know about all these other planets is we build better and better telescopes. And every once in a while they find a planet they think maybe potentially could sustain life. But they are so incredibly rare. I wish I knew the stat of like what percentage of planets have the ability to bear life, but Earth is this crazy unique planet that has an atmosphere and has air and has biological life and is able to sustain it. And so, yeah, it's part of it, yeah. I would say probably the atmosphere was made, in my opinion, when he separated the waters. But, Kim.
And remember, in Matthew 24:35, Jesus says, "Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not
Yep.
pass away."
Yep.
So heaven and earth go together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and think to the ultimate redemption, new heaven and new earth. So both are being remade. Barry and then Jeremy.
Just as a point, I think, the way I read this, the very first verse, when it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, that's like a statement. Then he goes on to explain how it was created. And that's why, because when you.
That's a fair way to look at it.
Being
Yep.
expanse, like the NIV says sky, which doesn't make sense, heaven, space, more. But I think it's what Norm was talking about too, and Bill's talking about, that's when he actually does
Yeah.
separate and create the earth as distinct from
Yep.
this blackness.
It's not a bad way to think about it, honestly. Yeah. Jeremy.
My argument for your 7 days,
Mm-hmm.
each day, he created Adam as an adult.
Yeah.
So he's all-powerful God. He could create the heavens and he could create earth as an adult planet
Yeah.
like it's millions of years old in one day.
Yeah. And so, if you guys didn't hear Jeremy, this is something I'm going to touch a little later, but I'll say it now just in case, because it's probably next week, to be honest. God created the earth with age. Adam and Eve, as well as we can understand, were already adults capable of being given in marriage and capable of reproducing. We asked this question, which came first, the chicken or the egg? It was the chicken. God created the animals. They were there. The plants were there. I believe there were, we know the Tigris and Euphrates River were already there. If you just went by a purely evolutionary way of the earth building, rivers had to develop. No, God created them. They were there. I believe there were mountains there at the beginning. Well, you look not that long later, there's a mountain for the ark to rest on. God created an earth that was in progress. And much like a watch where plate tectonics were still going to work and volcanoes were still going to erupt and things were still going to shift a little, but it was already going. And God created a place that did not have to develop the ability to sustain life, but already had the ability to sustain life. And so this is where, when you get in those, someone's giving you a rock that they say is 4.5 billion years old, well, you can, in some ways, say, yeah, it might be, but God created it 14,000 years ago, and so, but we'll get to that. Bill.
Well, two observations. One, we were all vegetarians to start with,
Mm-hmm.
which is interesting. The other one, though, just to build on that, is, if you have a house that is built out of rock, and somebody carbon dates the house,
Yeah.
so, well, this house is tens of thousands of years old, because all the rocks that make it are that old.
Yeah.
But the house is.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's one of the other kind of counter arguments I've had in my mind is God created an earth that looks old.
Yep.
Because he's God, he can create it.
Sure.
When the scientist looks at it and say, well, look at all these layers and all that, well, like you said, God created it that way.
Yeah. Yeah, I fully believe there were sedimentary and metamorphic layers when the Earth's foundations were laid down. Now, on fossils, that's a different, some people will say, I think God put the dinosaur bones there. I would say that's probably not a good way to look at it because death was not part of life yet, not when the Earth was created. And so I would say any fossil has to be after creation because fossil involves death. But were there layers under there? Yeah, probably. Yeah, and we're going to do a little section on age of the Earth, and we'll talk about carbon dating and radioactive dating a little bit. Jeff.
Is there a difference in the use of the word light in terms of, as it is in Genesis, and then downstream when Jesus says, I am the light, seek the light? I mean, is it one, is God the light? Because in Genesis, it's like, I created it, took a look at what I created outside of me, and
Yeah, I mean, in Hebrew and in Greek, obviously there's different words for light in Hebrew and Greek, but it's using the same words that describe physical light, but just like Jesus says, I am the vine, he, in that verse, doesn't mean I'm literally a vine, but I function like a vine. And so with light, you get this beautiful illustration of light being that which is near to God and darkness being that which is away from God. But it's still, it's a, what, someone help me with my English here. It's a simile? No. Metaphor? Metaphor, yeah.
So something's lost in the translation from the Hebrew to the Greek. It just comes across as one word, but there's different.
Well, I think in Genesis, God literally meant he created light, the physical light. And then when Jesus is talking about I am the light of the world, he is using a physical thing we all understand to explain a spiritual matter. So it's kind of like a parable where he's using earthly things to explain heavenly things that we can't grasp on our own. And so but it's still the same word. Okay, let's move here. So we got to start with this. And some of you are going to be more versed on this than others, and I'll explain a little bit so we all feel like we're understanding here. Is there any validity to modern theories of evolution and natural selection? I'm not saying the whole thing. Is there some truth in it? Yeah, there is. So you do not have to say evolution is completely wrong. There are parts of evolution that are very true and are observable and are happening. Now, I will completely argue with any point of view that says that everything is a result of evolution, or that everything came from one single-celled organism, or that we came from chimps. This is where I'm going to draw a line and say, no, not so fast. But there are parts of evolution and mechanisms within it that we can see. Natural selection, for instance, is the mechanism by which evolution happens. Who can give me like a one-sentence summary of what natural selection is? Survival of the fittest, yeah. Certain organisms have traits that make them survive in certain circumstances. Here's an example. The shorter giraffe dies because it can't reach the food. Okay, and so the taller giraffes are the ones that breed, and their genes get passed on. Okay, so, and we can see this in all kinds of stuff. Rabbits or hares in the Arctic are what color? White. Even though they're the same species as ones that live further down. Why are they white? Camouflage. And the way we understand that this happens scientifically is that the ones that are born brown get picked off by predators. And so eventually only the white ones survive, and they are the only ones passing DNA. Okay? This is natural selection. This is what we would call microevolution. Not change. Here's the difference between microevolution and macroevolution. Microevolution is change within a species. Macroevolution is change species to species. I would say probably good biblically to reject macroevolution, but accept microevolution. Same with viruses. We see viruses have generations so fast, we see them replicate. COVID, great example of this. There were different strains of it. COVID was mutating to allow itself to be more infectious, to spread itself. And the strains that weren't very infectious didn't pass, but also with COVID, the strains that made their host too sick and killed them, or made it so obvious they were sick, no one went around that person, also were not very genetically strong because they didn't get past. So this is what's interesting. Something like as bad as Ebola doesn't spread as easily as something like COVID, because you know when you have Ebola. And so this is where, like, survival of the fittest with a virus is a little different. The goal is to replicate within the host, but not kill the host. And so viruses that always kill the host eventually die out. And this is natural selection. And all of this can be observed, and to a degree it's accurate. This is, were humans taller, at least in this country, in 1900 or now? We're getting taller. Why are we getting taller? Nutrition's better, that's one reason.
I don't know about better. Basketball players make a lot of.
Basketball players? I mean, from a simple, and not to go after anyone who's shorter, it's a more, I mean, a long time ago, it was about warfare. You know, people who were bigger and stronger survived, and they passed their genes. And now, because we've got that built into us, usually height is seen as something desirable, and people who are taller usually have more success being married, and, you know, so there's part of this. Now, we're going to Guatemala in a few months. Compared to people in the Western world, people in Guatemala are very short. Why? Malnutrition. So in places where food has been scarce for a long, long time, it is genetically advantageous to be smaller. Because when a famine comes, you don't die. So this is why in some of these places where malnutrition has been a thing for hundreds and hundreds of years, people are getting smaller because the smaller people's genes are passed. This is an example of natural selection happening, where in a Western country, the taller folks generally pass their genes. In a country where malnutrition has been something for generation after generation, you're more likely to pass your genes if you don't need as many calories. So these are just examples of this. We'll do one more, skin color. Where does skin color come from? Closer to the equator. So if you're close to the equator, there's a lot of sun and heavy sun, and darker skin protects you. Now, if you grew up in Norway, why might you have light skin and light hair? Long, dark winters, but what is it biologically that you need that you can't get with dark skin? Vitamin D. Light hair allows vitamin D to penetrate, and you get this much-needed nutrient from the sun. This is actually interesting. African Americans in America are far more likely to be vitamin D deficient than white people. And it's part of this that they genetically grew up to be closer to the equator and to have constant sunlight, where most of us from Germany or Scandinavia grew up to have less sunlight, and now we all work indoors and we don't get that much sunlight, and so we've got a supplement. But me going outside for an hour versus a black man going outside for an hour, I get more vitamin D. My skin soaks up more. And it's just because my body, and this is where it's really cool what God designed, my body has adapted for where I lived.
But he's also more likely to burn.
I'm more likely to burn, yes. Yes, I need sunscreen. They need a vitamin D tablet, I need sunscreen, yeah, exactly. So this is natural selection, and we see it happen. You don't have to deny this mechanism. The question is, does the modern evolutionary theory that this happening over and over again will change a chimp into a human? So that's the question here, is modern evolutionary theory will say that it's not just about the giraffe being taller or your skin color being lighter, but rather you'll have a mutation like a sixth finger. And every once in a while, this is their argument. I'm playing devil's advocate here. Every once in a while, a mutation will come along that's advantageous. And so you've got a sixth finger, and for whatever, maybe you're living in a culture where you're swimming island to island, and that sixth finger is advantageous and makes you a better swimmer, and you pass your genes. And this is how they would argue everything came to be, from a single-celled life form. And to do this, they have to expand the timeline. They need those 4.5 billion years to make this mathematically work. It still becomes a little sketchy there, but do we understand kind of what the argument is at least? Okay. And we'll get into why I think that argument, that everything came from a single-celled life form and through natural selection eventually got to what we have today, cannot be true. That's kind of what we're looking at mostly here. But that does not mean that natural selection doesn't happen. You don't have to say it doesn't. But it's important to understand what it does and where the limitations might be. Any questions at this point? Yeah, Perry.
I was just going to say, the thing about the chimps, I saw in this program that they would never evolve because they did like they set up they don't have a way to communicate, they would never share with the others how you get the food.
Sure.
Where a human would share, hey, this is
Yeah.
what we do.
Well, this is, a sociologist would look at the development of, okay, where do we start becoming human instead of ape? And the development of language, from their argument, would be a big one. And I don't think we developed language. I think God gave us language as a gift. Language was imparted as a gift to Adam and Eve. I don't think there was ever a time where, I'll caveat this, but I don't think there was really ever a time where primitive humans were running around with no use of language. I think some things happened that separated humans, and we kind of devolved in some cases where we lost use of certain language. And you can see this maybe now in an uncontacted tribe, where their development of language might be a little different than pretty much everywhere else in the world. But as far back as we have history, there was language. Okay. Well, let's keep going here. So some Christians and many non-Christians want to buy, they sit in these classes and their professors are confident and sure of themselves, and they want to buy evolutionary theory, that everything came from a single-celled organism and slowly became a multi-celled organism and became a fish that became a mammal and crawled out, or became a lizard and then became a mammal. And, you guys have seen these charts. What theological problems arise from believing that we evolved rather than God made us as we are?
Well, if God gave us the dominion over all of us.
Okay. Yeah, so God said he gave us dominion, so it immediately throws out that at least that part of Genesis is not accurate. Okay. Jeff?
Is the evolutionist suggesting that we were just one among many with no distinction in the animal kingdom? At the beginning, it was just an even playing field, we were just thrown in along with all the other animal life forms? Because if it's
Yeah.
natural selection, survival of the fittest, and we weren't equipped with anything particularly unique, being human, I can't imagine, just that somehow we were better suited
Sure.
to survive.
Sure. Well, it is interesting. You look at natural selection, and there's nothing about humans that can do anything better than other animals except this. We can communicate and we can make tools. You look at like me versus a cat my size. The cat's stronger, it's faster, it can stand the elements better, all these things, And, like think of any animal your size that you can fight barehanded. You can't, because they have built-in weapons. What we have is the ability to communicate and make tools. And I would say that, an evolutionist would argue that's why we succeeded evolutionarily. They would say we developed away from all the other animals because of our capacity for intellect. That part of the argument could be sound if the rest were true. But they would say we at one point were one of the animals, and for whatever reason, and they wouldn't be able to explain this, we gained abilities that the other animals didn't. And kind of. Mike?
I guess the struggle in there for me is when you go from survival of the fittest and that, asexual beings have the advantage. They don't have
Sure.
have anything else to do. So
Sure.
that would make you stronger. Becoming a sexual being where you had to have
Yeah.
another person, and how did you develop this part, I have this part, and together we make a baby. That doesn't make sense from an evolutionary standpoint. That's a weakness in everything.
Well, I'll try not to take too many asides here, but I can't help myself.
We take you down the rabbit.
Some scientists would argue that bacteria are more successful than humans because they can live in any condition. Like if we had a nuclear holocaust, we wouldn't survive, but the bacteria would. And, it's just a different way of thinking about it. But, what is the dominant species on Earth? It's humans. Like, what's the species changing the Earth? It's humans. And that fits with...
Good. Why did they come?
Exactly, yeah. That fits with the biblical narrative. God gave us dominion to rule over, and you can be a good ruler and you can be a bad ruler. And we've done some good and some bad. Yeah. what other theological problem other than if evolutionary theory is true, then at least part of the Bible is not true. That's a problem, and when you start believing that, it becomes a slippery slope. Yeah.
And one comment I would make is they lump everything into the word evolution.
Yeah.
It includes both species changing, it's the adaptation, plus it's also the Big Bang, the whole creation.
Sure.
It all lumped into one, and you can't look at it that way. Because one thing scientists cannot explain is where things come from. They can only deal with what they see.
Yeah. We'll get there. I promise we'll touch this stuff. Yeah. Yeah.
I think it comes into this discussion because, you said earlier, you have to be careful when you talk about evolution because there's different
Yeah.
pieces of it.
Well, this is where it's good to be precise with your language. Yeah. Here's the big one. Huge theological problem with modern evolution. God says we were made in his image. So if evolution's true, exactly where does a chimp become made in God's image? Where does it flip? What stage in that missing link that might be? What stage in this is that the image of God? And, this is the question. How can I be made in the image of God, made unique? Also, Jesus died for us, not the animals. How can that be true, which is a pretty critical point in our faith, and also understand that I came from a chimp, and long before that I was a protozoa, and before that I was a single-celled bacteria. It becomes a huge problem theologically that really, and see, the people who mostly espouse this aren't thinking deep enough. Because if you think deep enough, you've got a huge conflict. Barry?
Just the way the creation story goes, he created the animals and all living creatures. Then he created man. They're two distinct things. They're not the same.
Yeah.
And it's clear so theologically, it's clear from Scripture that
Yeah.
you can't mix them.
Yeah, one's got language, and we'll talk about this, the capacity for love. You guys, I did a sermon on this at one point, on being able to love our enemies and altruism. We'll talk a little about this next week, but this is a trait only humans have. And actually, evolutionists can't explain why humans can do self-sacrificial things. Because evolution suggests that everything is done to reproduce. That the only real motivator in all of biology is to pass your genes. And that can be argued in the animal kingdom. But human beings, we have so many examples of people doing things for the sake of others, sacrificing themselves for someone totally not related to them. And this is something we will talk about more next time, unless someone has a really pressing question right now on it. Jeff, you looked like you had a question.
Well, if we were just in the mix and it was evolution,
Yeah.
human evolution would be within this broader ecosystem.
Yeah.
Right? Evolving in harmony with everything. So why would we evolve to be so inadaptable to the rest of everything around us?
That's a good question. Yeah, well, exactly. Why if the grid broke down, would the cat survive, but I would die? It is a good question. I guess an evolutionist would say, if I'm playing devil's advocate, they would say, we've evolved to a point where we used to have hair to keep us warm, but then we learned how to make coats, and so I don't need it anymore, so I lost. It was not necessarily protected in my genes. That's how they'd argue it. But yeah, it's a good question. It's a good question. Let's see. So let me just say this. Does someone believing evolution necessarily mean they're not Christian? No. What is necessary to be saved? To trust Jesus Christ, that he died for you and has forgiven your sins and is your Lord and Savior. That's the necessary piece to be saved. It is possible within an imperfect human being to get other points of theology wrong, which, let's be honest, we all have other points of theology wrong. We all have some things we believe that is probably not true. And yet we're still saved by virtue of that simple faith in Jesus. So it does not necessarily make someone not Christian to believe this. But I would argue it presents some possible problems that we should be a little careful about. And if someone gets too into it and really thinks about it, eventually they come to these hard questions that they've got to decide. Do I believe what God has revealed to me, or do I believe what a scientist might claim to be true? And not all scientists are evolutionists, by the way. I had a few college professors who were not, but were still teaching. And now they had to keep that quiet, but because it's not acceptable in that community to be a scientist teaching and not buy into all of this. But we'll talk about where some of the holes are. Any questions at this point? Yeah. Good. All right. So let's start talking about some holes in evolutionary theory. And this is just kind of what we're going to do. I want to enhance your toolbox here and just equip you with some things that are not going to make you like a debater on this, but some things to really just strengthen your faith and say there really are a lot of holes in this. When I was going to college, I had done Christian grade school and Christian high school, and I was going to be a biology teacher. And I chose, for financial reasons, to go to the state school. And so I was going to this state-funded liberal arts college to get a bachelor's in biology and then a master's in education. And there was a point where I was pretty worried about this. I was worried what I was going to be confronted with from the scientific perspective. And there was this little part of me that was worried that I was going to be presented with something so convincing that I lost my faith over it. The complete opposite was true. The more science I learned, the more my faith was actually strengthened. One, because it was just very apparent, and this is the difference coming from a Christian worldview versus coming from a worldview that might want to disprove God. It was very clear in every single class how much we don't know. Another thing I kept seeing was the complexity and beauty of God's creation, how fantastically amazing biology and this world is, and all the more convincing to me that this did not happen by accident. But there were lots of classes where I'd be just sitting there being taught something, and I'd just be like, that's the best you got? Like, really? This has all our scientists convinced? And so for me, it was really a convincing experience. Now, I know some people get there and they have these people they look up to as very intelligent telling them, yeah, this is a fact, and they believe it. We are impressionable creatures. And this is where maybe in the church we got to be doing a little better job of giving our young people a little better scientific foundation on, hey, this is just a theory, and they're going to tell you this, and here's something to think about as you hear it. So that's kind of what we're doing here, and maybe I should be doing this with the youth group. But so number one, observing evolution. Has science ever observed a species-to-species change? No. It has never been observed. Now, an evolutionist, and when I say evolutionist, I'm talking about someone who buys into the whole package. Okay, so that's how I'm going to use the language here. An evolutionist would say that's because it takes too much time. And humans have not been recording history long enough to have observed species-to-species change. That's how they would argue that. But it is worth noting, even on microscopic levels, like bacteria, we have not seen species flip to another species. Okay, Barry?
I was laughing because how could a human being observe himself being transformed from a chimp?
Well, sure. But in theory, I could observe a bunny flip into something else. That's what I mean. Evolution in any sense has never been observed.
And you probably won't, because like you said, how long does it take to
Yeah,
do that?
and that's the argument.
It's not like
Yeah. Now, they would say if we exist another 100,000 years that we will see it. You know, yeah. So, Bill.
The other counter I've had to that is, given the vast variety of life on Earth, shouldn't there be some species that are in transition? Like at this point in time, if
Yeah.
we look at all of the species, there should
Yes.
be a certain number of them,
Yes.
even a small number, that are somehow transitioning, but we don't even see that.
Yeah, if this is correct, we should see more transitions.
At least one.
Yeah, or something that is in transition.
Right.
And, yep.
And the question is, if this is true, why are there still lingering bits of the unsuccessful?
Yeah.
Like, if the chimp went to a man, why are there still chimps?
Yeah, so here's how they'd argue it. I might not be helping my argument by telling you how they'd argue it. When I think they have, well, how they would argue it is the bottleneck effect, genetic bottleneck. They would say at one point, a section of chimpanzees got separated from the others. Maybe due to dividing continents, maybe due to a flood, maybe due to rivers shifting or something like that. And that separated group was the one where the genetic change took place. And so over here you have the evolution from chimp to one of the intermediaries, and over there you've still got chimps. That's how they'd explain it, at least. Again, I don't think God set up the world in a way where natural selection actually allows for one kind to shift to another kind. I think God set it up where individual species could adapt to their environment, which we talked about all the ways we see that. We see it all over the place. But we have never observed one species jumping to another. And here's my argument, that all the species that ever were created. And we have less than we did because a lot have gone extinct. But God made all the kinds that there ever were going to be. And many have gone away, but nothing new has come up. Because the harnessing of creative power, I don't believe, happens by accident. And we'll talk about entropy and the laws of thermodynamics and why that, there's a lot in this anyway. But I think it takes creative order to make something new. So does that make sense? We've never observed evolution. That's point one. Point two, similar, is the missing link. So take a look. You know, on the left you've got a chimp. On the right you've got a human. They would have names for the intermediaries. These new species that were created after chimpanzee and then evolved to another species, and all of them became a little more human-like. Now in the fossil record, we have a whole lot of chimp skeletons, thousands and thousands. We've got thousands and thousands of human skeletons. We have a few skeletons of chimps that have slightly more human features. A few. And we have a few human skeletons where, you know, maybe Neanderthals would be a good example of this. I think Neanderthals were just humans that looked a little different. Okay. My brother did his 23andMe, and he's 3% Neanderthal. Okay, which I want to make fun of him for, but that means I am too. So, and if you're from Northern Europe, you probably are too. Okay, because Neanderthals and humans could breed, which means what? They're the same species. And
Explains a lot.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. It does. Catherine, quiet. Anyway.
Did Neanderthals have like an uncanny ability to throw an object into a hole?
They might have. But Neanderthals and humans absolutely interbred. And they're just variations of humans, is the way I look at it. They are both made in the image of God. And I don't think Neanderthals just died out. They were, you know, and you could argue this on biblical terms. I'm sure someone's got theories of what happened to giants and stuff like that. And maybe as some of that, Neanderthals were bigger and stronger slightly than the other Homo sapiens. Anyway. But Neanderthal is an example of a human with slightly more ape-like features. Slight. It'd be someone with a more distinct brow line and bigger muscles, basically. But still, if you saw one today, they would look human to you. They would look human.
He's on the Geico commercial.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah. Gabby?
So were the giants human as well?
Yeah, like the way we understand it, Goliath was a human, and a tall human. And maybe that is a possible explanation for what this segment of differentiated humanity that we don't see anymore is. So we've got a whole bunch of these, we've got a whole bunch of these, a little bit here, a little bit here. We get here and almost nothing, and then we get here, doesn't exist. If this was true, and it took I'm trying to remember what their date is for how long it took to go from chimp to ape, or chimp to human, but I want to say it's at least, I want to say 500,000 years, but I don't think that's right. But we would have significant fossil record of all of these. You guys want to see what the best missing link they have is? The Lucy skeleton. Is this going to work? Dave, am I minimized? There it is. That is the best missing link science has ever found. I don't know about you, but I'm not exactly convinced that is significant evidence that there's an intermediary between chimps and humans. That's the Lucy skeleton. It's what they would call an Australopithecus, which they believe would have been an intermediary between humans and chimps. There might have been a species of monkey that is. Or this might be some scattered bones of a human child. I don't know. I don't really know how to explain exactly what this is. All I know is you've got one of those, and that's like 15% of a skeleton. And this is your best evidence that there was, and for this to be true, these things would have had to exist for millions of years and been quite developed. Because remember, these are going from chimp to human, and these intermediaries would have had to be starting to gain intelligence, starting to gain ability to communicate. If we evolved from chimps and had been strong enough to pass their genetic information to become another species. And again, you go back to this and you get to somewhere in the middle, and that's what they have. Now you go back since the time of Darwin, and there have been dozens of missing links that were fabricated. Because Darwin admitted in his writings that the biggest hole in his theory was missing links in the fossil record. He even said something to the effect of that he believed in the coming years, now that this theory of evolution had gained traction, that they would start looking for them and they would find them. But if they didn't find them, he would take it all back. Now, he died before that ever happened. I don't know if he ever would have. But it's been, I should remember when Darwin was. It's been like 150 years, and we have not found this stuff. We have not found any significant evidence that there were these intermediaries between chimps and humans, and that they existed for a long time. Instead, we've got a whole bunch of chimps and a whole bunch of humans, and the further you get from chimp and human, the less you have. And in the middle, it's a vacuum of nothing. That Australopithecus, or whatever they call it, is much closer to chimp than human.
It's the theory of evolution.
It's a theory.
I was curious what they teach in the schools, my kids have been out of school a long time.
Yeah, they teach this in
I hope
schools.
they're saying it's theory.
I mean, they'll say the theory of evolution, but it is not taught as a theory. It is taught as fact. This is taught as fact in our high schools and in our universities, unless maybe you've got a specific teacher who doesn't buy it and downplays it a little bit. But they're not really allowed to do that. And I think it's important we understand their argument. And so I think you should be taught it, but taught in a way of understanding that this is a theory, and here's why. One, it does conflict with the Bible, and two, there are a whole lot of holes in it. Norm.
The book that I've been reading now, it says, discovered in the Alwash Valley of Ethiopia in 1974, and conventionally dated at 3.2 million years ago. Lucy is the fourth known, most complete, and most famous specimen of what you say.
Okay.
Despite usually being depicted as very human-like, Lucy's species is classified as non-human.
Yeah. Oh, for sure it's non-human. They would have said it was one of the steps. You know, chimps didn't just become humans. In their argument, they would say chimps became the next step, and they became Homo habilis, which is Lucy, and then they became this, and then they became Neanderthal, and then they became human. But yeah, what you just read, they found 4 of these, and that's the most complete. They've got 4, and that's the most complete, and this is what we're going off of. And again, you still would need other intermediaries to make this true. And so, again, Darwin admitted right now we don't have it, but I think it's there and I think we'll find it. And again, with all our technology 150 years later, look at Darwin was traveling around in a sailboat. And now we've got computers in our pocket, and we still haven't found it. And here's my argument, because it's not there. We're not going to find what is not there. But it's good to know the fossil record does not have it. Now, they've got arguments for all of this, of course. They would say not everything fossilizes, and they would say maybe these didn't exist as long as humans and chimps have. But there should be more evidence than there is, and there just isn't. There just isn't, and that's why they're still looking. Any questions on this? This is probably where we got to stop. I'll end with this thought. And we'll cover this again next time, but just in case you miss next time, you've got to understand this. Why do people believe this evolutionism when there are so many holes in it?
Because they don't want to believe in God. They don't want to
Yeah.
be controlled by somebody.
Yeah. I'll give you two thoughts on this. Satan, yeah. Some people believe because they don't know any better. Someone told me, and so I took it. But there are people very close to the science who should be able to see all these holes and don't. And I would just say this. This is one of Satan's greatest lies. And it's very similar to the lie at the very beginning. Because if all this is true, if evolution is true, and I came from a single-celled organism that once was a chimp and eventually got to humans, then I am the most evolved creature that's ever existed. You and me. We're the top. Nothing smarter or more intelligent has ever existed. And what does that make me? God. What was the temptation to Adam and Eve in the garden? To be like God. There is a significant temptation in humans, and this is why so many people will blindly accept this, and so many people who should be able to see the holes in it don't see it. It's because they want to believe it. They want to believe that we are the most intelligent creatures that have ever existed, that we can look down on all our ancestors as less evolved, that we can be the arbiters of right and wrong, and functionally that there's no one looking over my shoulder and I do what I want. This is the temptation to be like God, and Satan has been very crafty with this one. And functionally, it's on faith. You know, you start asking an evolutionist about all the holes I'm going to bring up, and they'll say, well, we just haven't found it yet, or we haven't figured out that part yet. And they're making expressions of faith, that I believe that this will work. We just haven't gained the scientific knowledge to understand it completely yet. They are taking significant leaps of faith because they want it to be true. And this is where we just need to be presented with all the holes, because you got to believe in something. You got to have a God. But it's important to know that this is far from proof. What they have to say is something with a whole lot of holes, and some of those holes I would say make it, I would say disprove it. You know, they wouldn't say that. They would say we need to find more, we need to understand more. But there is a faith aspect to believing evolutionary theory and buying into all of it. Barry?
Do you think this is more of scientific inquiry versus I need to disprove God? I think, because my opinion is, most people that go after that, they can't accept God, they can't accept that. So they're, and partly because God doesn't explain how he does this.
Yeah.
So they're looking for something else, but they're doing it because they can't accept God. It comes to the same thing about self
Yeah.
and me. But I don't know, did you feel the scientific community tends to be more, let's say, agnostic or non-believer?
Oh, for sure. There are many more scientists who are non-believers than who are believers. Now, there's lots of good scientists who are believers. Now, there's two different categories in that. Some don't buy into this stuff, and some try and straddle this weird line where I believe evolution, but also believe Jesus is my Savior and try and make it work. And that's like many other temptations. You know, we talked about the LGBTQ thing. They're doing the same thing. They're trying to take what they want and leave what they have a hard time grappling with. I wouldn't say most scientists, the ones I've been exposed to, again, this was in Missouri, a little more near the heartland and some more traditional values.
You haven't evolved as much.
Yeah, exactly. They weren't necessarily, most were not antagonistic to Christians. Some were. So some it's just I don't believe it. Some, but there are very many, and it's growing. Now it's been 10 years since I had that education. It's growing where a lot of it is antagonistic. But yeah. Anyway, we'll keep going with this discussion next time. Any questions someone's dying to ask that can't be handled next time? Okay. Prayer requests.